April 1945, Bavaria. An American patrol hammered on the door of a farmhouse. What waited inside would reach the desk of one of the most terrifying generals in the entire conflict within 60 minutes. A German family, a concealed space, and a man who had existed in total darkness for more than a year. When Patton received the report, he didn't dispatch a subordinate. He drove there personally. What he did upon arrival, that was not what anyone anticipated from the general with the ivory-handled revolvers, the roaring speeches. The man whose entire worldview seemed built around fire corridors and axes of advance. What he did stunned every soldier in that farmhouse, and what followed would quietly vanish from official records for decades. To grasp what that farmhouse represented, you need to understand what April 1945 actually looked like at ground level. The war stood 3 weeks from its conclusion, but that conclusion was anything but orderly. Not a single front giving way, 1,000 simultaneous disintegrations, German formations evaporating, roads choked with displaced civilians, villages draping white linens before the Americans even appeared, and everywhere, the physical residue of what the Reich had been doing in the years before those columns rolled through. Patton had already walked through Ohrdruf. He had witnessed what existed inside those camps. He had moved through the documentation of systematic, organized, industrial-scale savagery, and emerged on the other side carrying something his diary entries from those weeks describe with an emotional specificity remarkable for a man who almost never committed feelings to paper directly. He wrote that he lacked the language. A man who had served in 2 world wars, who had devoted his career to studying the worst acts human beings inflicted on each other under the banner of conflict. And he could not find the words. 2 weeks later, a patrol turned down a farm road outside a small Bavarian town. And everything Patton had been carrying since Ohrdruf suddenly acquired a different frame. Because what that patrol discovered was not evidence of what the Reich had done. It was evidence of what a handful of Germans had quietly refused to do. The farm was stone-built, low-roofed, with a vegetable garden someone had recently turned for spring planting, indistinguishable from 1,000 other Bavarian homesteads. The patrol cleared it as routine procedure. In the cellar behind a rack of preserved vegetables arranged with slightly too much precision against the far wall, they found a man, thin, pale in the manner of someone who had not encountered direct sunlight in a very long time, wearing civilian clothes that did not belong to him, holding a small book. The soldiers needed a moment to process what they were seeing. Then comprehension arrived. He had occupied that cellar for 14 months. His name was David Feldman, 43 years old, Jewish. And the German farm family living in the house above, a farmer in his 50s, his wife, their 2 children, had been sheltering him, feeding him, shielding him since February 1944. Under Nazi law, what that family had done constituted a crime punishable by death. Not prison, death. They had done it regardless. For 14 months, through 2 winters, through the disintegration of the Reich around them, through the artillery growing louder with each passing week. The patrol sergeant radioed the situation up the chain. The report reached Patton. And Patton did something no one had scheduled for him that morning. His Jeep appeared on the farm road 40 minutes after the radio call. He arrived with his aide and 2 military police officers. No formal escort, no ceremony. The Hoffman family, the farmer Georg, his wife Margaret, their children, stood in the main room when Patton entered. Feldman had been brought up from the cellar. He sat in a chair near the window, blinking against the April light with the measured caution of a man whose eyes had spent so long adjusting to darkness they had not yet remembered what brightness meant. Patton paused in the doorway, surveyed the room, looked at Feldman for a long moment, looked at the family. Then he did something that made the American soldiers present glance at one another. He dragged a chair across the kitchen floor, positioned it beside Feldman's, and sat down. Not to conduct a formal interview, not to assess the situation and issue orders. He sat beside the man the way you sit when you want someone to know there is no clock running, that what they carry deserves space. Through his aide, who spoke German, he asked the simplest questions first. What is your name? Where are you from? Then Patton asked about his family. and the room shifted into a silence that had nothing to do with rank or protocol. Feldman's wife had been taken in 1943, his children before that. He said he did not know where they were sent. He said he had spent 14 months in the cellar, not knowing. He said this without drama, in the flat, measured cadence of a man who has repeated the facts so often they can no longer crack his voice, even though they have not stopped cracking everything else. Patton was still for a moment. Then he said something no one in that room anticipated. He said, quote, "0," the aide translated. Feldman looked at Patton, not with hope, not with the sudden exhale of a man receiving what he desperately needed to hear, with something far more layered. The look of someone who had learned across 14 months in darkness not to trust kindness offered as a handhold. He held Patton's gaze anyway. Patton did not break it. Then he stood and turned to the Hoffman family. And here the story pivots in a direction nobody inside that farmhouse saw coming. The American soldiers present were waiting for orders. They understood what procedure demanded. Feldman needed documentation, transport to the nearest displaced persons facility. Processing through the administrative machinery the Army was constructing for precisely these cases. The Hoffman family needed assessment, their cooperation with occupation forces recorded, their wartime conduct noted. Standard protocol. Patton issued those orders. He told his aide what needed to happen for Feldman. He arranged transport. He made sure the medical evaluation was scheduled. But before any of that, he did something the soldiers present later described as the moment the room changed. He turned to George Hoffman and, through his aide, said this: "I want you to understand something. What you did, what your family did, required a kind of courage I have never asked of any soldier under my command." He paused. "I have ordered men into artillery fire. I have ordered men across defended rivers. I have asked men to do things that seemed impossible and watched them succeed. What I have never ordered, what cannot be ordered, is what you chose to do every morning for 14 months. That kind of courage cannot be commanded. You either carry it or you don't." He looked at Marguerite. He looked at the children. "You carried it. All of you. And I want you to know that I understand what it cost." The Hoffman family said nothing. Marguerite had her hands folded in her lap. George was staring at the floor. The children watched Patton with the wide-open attention of young people who sense something enormous happening without fully grasping what it means. Then Patton said one final thing. "This family is to be recorded by name in the official report. Their actions are to be documented in full. Any administrative question regarding their status under the occupation is to be resolved in their favor. These people are to be treated as the allies they are." He walked out, got in his Jeep, drove back to headquarters. And then, quietly, something began happening to the record of that morning. Something that took decades to fully surface. The official Third Army report for April 1945 covers the advance through Bavaria in considerable operational detail. Unit positions, road conditions, enemy contacts, the logistics of pushing a massive force through terrain being simultaneously liberated and reorganized. The farmhouse on that road outside the Bavarian town appears briefly. A patrol contact, a displaced civilian recovered, a German family cooperative with occupation forces, the civilian transferred to appropriate facilities. That is all. No names, no description of Patton's presence at the scene, no record of what he said to the Hoffman family, no documentation of his instruction that they be treated as allies and recorded by name. Military historians who combed through Third Army records during the 1970s and 1980s, working on broader projects that documented the liberation of Jewish survivors and the role of non-Jewish rescuers across occupied Europe, noticed the gap. The incident itself was traceable, but the documentation terminated precisely where the meaningful details should have begun. This pattern was not isolated. Throughout the Third Army's final weeks of campaign records, the same structure repeats. Operations described at command level. No human texture. No personal detail that witness testimony and private letters confirm actually took place. Some of this is simply how military paperwork functions. It captures what is militarily relevant. A general's conversation in a farmhouse kitchen does not qualify under that narrow definition. But certain researchers began identifying something beyond standard bureaucratic limitation. something that made the absence feel less like routine and more like deliberate editorial choice. This is where the story grows genuinely complicated. And this is where honest history demands stating what most retellings of this incident omit entirely. George Patton, the man who sat beside David Feldman in that kitchen and promised they would search for his family, also wrote things in his private diary during the months that followed. Things that are deeply, authentically disturbing. Through the summer and autumn of 1945, as the displaced persons crisis unfolded, hundreds of thousands of Jewish Holocaust survivors crowded into temporary facilities across occupied Germany. Patton recorded his observations in language that historians have classified as anti-Semitic. Those entries do not soften when placed in context. They do not improve with charitable reading. They exist in the record. They are documented. They are part of the man. He was ultimately relieved of command of the Third Army, in part because his management of the displaced persons situation, including active resistance to improving conditions at survivor facilities, violated Army policy and violated basic human decency. This is the same man who sat beside Feldman, the same man who told the Hoffman family their courage surpassed anything he could command, the same man who emerged from Ohrdruf, unable to articulate what he had witnessed, and the same man whose diary, months later, employed language that belonged to the very ideology responsible for building the camps. Both realities are true, simultaneously, within the same person. This is the element of the story that refuses clean resolution, that cannot render Patton simply heroic or simply monstrous. It demands holding two verified truths at once, and resisting the impulse to let either erase the other. The farmhouse happened. The diary entries happened. The question of how one man contains both, how the same person can perceive individual humanity with such clarity and then fail it so absolutely in the aggregate, has no comfortable answer. It may be the most essential question the farmhouse raises. The Army's tracing services received David Feldman's family names. The search consumed 3 months. His wife had not survived. His daughter had not survived.